Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kikuyo. The title of today's talk is Buddha's 8 Streams of Consciousness. Before we get into that, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you'll be notified when I post talks in the future. If you wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that'd be great too. As Buddhists, our primary objective is to study the world around us. More specifically, to study the nature of reality, and then use that information to end suffering for ourselves and others. We're like auto mechanics. We rip apart the car engine, see how it works, put it back together so that if it breaks in the future, we know how to repair it. In Buddhism, we do that, but we do it with our mind, breaking it down in its component parts so that we can determine where suffering comes from. And then we can find solutions to that suffering. Now, I'm going to break down the total chain of how that works, and then I'm going to walk you through that and why the 8 streams of consciousness model is so important. Simply put, the 8 streams of consciousness result in the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates result in clinging or attachments. Our attachments result in greed, anger, and ignorance. And our greed, anger, and ignorance result in suffering. Here's how that works. The first 6 streams of consciousness are fairly straightforward. They are sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell, and thought. So our 5 senses, as we know them in the West, plus our thinking mind. Now, what's important to understand about this, however, is that our understanding of the senses is different in Buddhism. In the West, we see ourselves as a perceiver, standing over here by ourselves, and we're looking out into the world, interacting with objects that are separate from us. However, the Buddhist model says that we are actually formed, created via streams of consciousness coming into us. So instead of us on the inside looking out, it's the outside looking in. This is why sometimes you'll hear people say in Buddhism that all is one or all is interconnected, because we are constantly being created and we are creating the world around us. How does that work? We'll use the example of sight. So we have our sight organ, our eyes. They make contact with an object out there in the world, and the contact between our sight organ and the sight object creates a stream of consciousness. We have a sensation as a result of that stream of consciousness, one of the 5 aggregates, good, bad, or neutral. We also have a perception. We label that stream of consciousness. Let's say we call it a chair. So between our sensation and our perception of the object, that stream of consciousness coming into our minds, we think good chair. Now, that just does not just happen with one object in the world, of course. As we look around the room, we come in contact with multiple objects via our eyes. Wall, chair, table, ceiling, cat. And as we do that, as all of these visual streams of consciousness come together, that creates our picture of the world as we know it. It's very similar to how the old school movie projectors used to work. It's all digital now, but when I was a child, they had a giant roll of film that would play at the back of the theater, and it would roll. And there was a light that would go through the picture, and then it would be expanded and project onto the screen. And to the moviegoer, it looked like one continuous picture. It was only if the roll of film malfunctioned and started to slow down that you could see that it was actually hundreds, if not thousands, of individual pictures that you were looking at. Our sight works in exactly the same way. The visual world looks solid. It's all one piece, but that's an illusion, like a movie. In reality, there are an infinite number of streams of sight consciousness coming into us that creates the world as we know it. And of course, this is true of all of our senses. Now, you might say, well, how do we know that it's stream of consciousness coming in and not us looking out? Well, very simply. Hold up your hand, like so. Now, without moving your head, closing your eyes, moving your hand, or covering your hand with something else, stop looking at your hand. As long as your hand is in front of your face and you're looking at it, meaning your sight organ is making contact with this object, you're going to see your hand. You can't stop it. In the same way, if you reach down with your hands and touch the floor, you're going to feel the floor. You can't stop that physical sensation. This is how we know that we are not in control of sight, smell, touch, taste, hearing, thought, consciousness. They are coming in to us via our organs of sensory perception. Thought is another great example. You think you're in charge of your thoughts? Don't think about pink elephants. Now, of course, the moment I say pink elephants, the thought of one pops into your head because thought consciousness comes in to us. We don't make our thoughts any more than we make our sight, our hearing, our smell, etc. But where does our sense of self come from if it's all nothing but streams of consciousness coming together? Well, that is the seventh stream of consciousness. So we've gone through 6 already, our physical senses plus thought. 7th is something called manas. This is the illusory sense of self. And this is where the trouble starts. But first, let's figure out where manas comes from. And to give you an example of how it works, we can think of a thunderstorm. Now, we've all experienced thunderstorms. They exist. But they're also an illusion because they don't exist as a separate, permanently abiding self. They, like us, are an aggregate of things. The storm is the clouds. The storm is the thunder and lightning. The storm is the wind, the rain. If it's a bad storm, there may even be some broken trees littered across the yard when it's done. That said, if we pick up one of those broken trees, if we look into the clouds, let's say we take an airplane and fly around, if we were to somehow take a picture of a lightning bolt, none of those individual things are the storm. It's all of them coming together that create the storm. And of course, the storm isn't in control of any of that. It exists as long as they come together, and as soon as karma causes them to break apart, no more storm. It's the same with us, the same with manas. We are a storm created by the 6 streams of consciousness that I discussed earlier. They create the illusion of self. And as long as they come together, we exist. The moment they stop, we don't exist. Now, why does this cause problems? Because the streams of consciousness create the sense of self, and that results in clinging or attachments to the 5 aggregates. What are the 5 aggregates? They are form, sensation, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. Now, what does that mean? Form is the physical world as we know it. Sensation is a very basic mental formation, good, bad, or neutral. Perception is the label we place on things. Mental formations are thoughts, memories, and emotions. And consciousness emerges when the 5 aggregates, when the 8 streams of consciousness come together. That's the storm. Consciousness and manas are not exactly the same thing if we want to be technical, but practically speaking, they are. And this becomes a problem because if we become attached to our sensations, let's say we only want to interact with things that are good and we never want to interact with things that are bad, we become very stressed, right? Because we're constantly running towards the good things and away from the bad things, and we can't control the outside world very well, so we're never in a state of homeostasis. Or maybe we get very attached to our mental formations. So thoughts come into our heads and maybe they're sad or angry. And because we are attached to them, because we think that that anger is who we are, instead of being able to just let it go, we hold on to it. And that holding on to that anger, to that mental formation, causes suffering. More specifically, it causes greed, anger, and ignorance, which then causes suffering. So, to review, we start off with the 8 streams of consciousness, which leads to the 5 aggregates, which leads to a sense of self, which leads to clinging or attachments, which leads to greed, anger, and ignorance, which then leads to suffering. Now, you'll notice I keep saying the 8 streams of consciousness, but I've only talked about 7. There is one more stream of consciousness, and that's the storehouse consciousness, also known as our Buddha nature. This is the seed of enlightenment that's within all of us. In the sutras, it's often said that our Buddha nature is always there, but it's covered over by our defilements. We understand this if we understand the 8 streams of consciousness model of Buddhism, because we have our physical and mental senses, we have manas, we have the 5 aggregates, and under all of that is our Buddha nature. So in order to see our Buddha nature, to manifest it in daily life and realize enlightenment, we have to see through all those illusory notions I just mentioned. How do we do that? Well, we do that by letting go of our attachments to them. That doesn't mean we stop our sight or our hearing or our smell, of course. It simply means we understand that just because I smell something and the sensation I have is that that's a bad smell, I don't need to act on it. It's not a big deal. Just because I see someone and the mental formation that appears is I don't like them, doesn't mean I have to say something rude. I can just keep walking by. And if we're able to do that, if we're able to investigate our streams of consciousness, notice when we have streams that aren't so helpful, we don't beat ourselves up about it, we simply just don't act on it. In the same way that if there's a storm brewing outside, we stay indoors. Or if we do go out, we wear a raincoat. When we do this, when we let go of our attachments to the 5 aggregates, to the streams of consciousness, the storm settles in our mind and our Buddha nature naturally emerges. This is why practices like seated meditation are so powerful, because as we train ourselves to not act on everything we see, smell, hear, taste, touch, as we train ourselves to not act on every mental formation, every perception, every sensation that we have in our mind, they lose their power over us. Until slowly but surely they start to disappear. And all that's left is Buddha. Amitabha.